Hey guys, welcome to CLS Social Studies.
Hey, it's CLS Social Studies.
Today we're going to go ahead and cover life on the American home front between the years of 1941 1945, World War II. We know that the war was happening over in Europe, so what was going on here on American soil? Well, technically, the United States was the largest military power in the world. It had an ample supply of natural resources, advanced infrastructure, a capital base that was becoming more solid by the day. And after Pearl Harbor happened, the United States joins World War II. Now, the United States is now joining World War II. What are the Americans going to do, and what is Franklin Roosevelt going to do about having us supply the war? Remember that we said World War II gets the United States out of the Great Depression. Well, here's your answer how. Franklin Roosevelt creates something what we call the War Production Board, right here, the War Production Board. And what is the War Production Board? Well, Roosevelt wanted to make the United States what we call the arsenal of democracy. He wanted to put our factories to work building war supplies. So the War Production Board converts the factories that were creating personal products for consumption to now creating things for the war effort. An example of this right here, like you see on the screen, is like an automobile company like Ford Motor Company would now be producing plane engines or tanks or something like that for the war. They would stop producing personal goods for consumption and just transfer over to war effort supplies. So that's what the War Production Board does. Now, what happens to these factories? You think you're going to need all these people to go to the factories and work, right? Well, what happens here by the numbers in the United States? The United States needs a bigger army to fight World War II. The peacetime draft at the time drafted about 1.5 million men to go into the army. So now you have a military force of about 1.5 million. By the time the end of World War II happens, we will put 12 million soldiers into the war effort. So what does that do to the labor at home here in the United States? If you take 12 million able-bodied workers out of the factories, you have to replace them, right? So who replaces the workers? Well, it's just like previous time in the history of the United States. What do the workers or who steps in for those men who go off to war? Number one, Rosie the Riveter, right? These propaganda posters cause many women to join the workforce. About 6 million women step to the plate and go ahead and go and work in these factories. But you know the math. I know the math. If you have 6 million women and you have 12 million shortages, and it might not be 12 million, it might be less, but if you have that many shortages, who else is going to take the place of all those men who went out to war? Well, don't forget, you have other groups of people in the United States. One of these groups of people were the African Americans. How did the African Americans fare during World War II? Well, a lot of them served. About 1 million African Americans went to World War II, and they served in segregated units like the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen, that famed flying force, flew thousands upon thousands of missions. They were fantastic flyers, but they could not land on what you would call a normal airstrip or a normal air base. Okay? The Tuskegee Airmen actually had to land on segregated airways. Even if they were supporting flight and bombing missions, they could work side to side with other Americans, white Americans, but they still had to land in segregated airstrips. The other people now that we were talking about who are making up those lost factory jobs, African Americans, here you go. This is that second great migration of African Americans leaving the South, escaping the discrimination, going to the North for economic opportunities. So you have African Americans moving up to the North as well, taking these jobs that were lost to the soldiers going off to war. They were celebrating something called the Double V campaign. Put up two peace signs, right? The Double V campaign. With the idea behind the Double V campaign is that African Americans were feeling that they were going to achieve victory abroad at the war, meaning that we will win World War II, and they would achieve victory at home with democracy, meaning that they will actually end segregation in America. Now we know that that doesn't happen for another 20 some years during the Civil Rights Movement. Another group of Americans who prospered during this time were Mexican Americans. They were allowed to cross the border to assist with harvest season in the southwest part of the United States. This was a program called the Bracero Guest Worker Program. So how does the United States supply the war effort? We talked about people, right? We sent the men and women, we sent them out to Europe to go to war. We had African Americans moving to the north to take jobs. We had women going to the north to take jobs in these factories. The War Production Board made it so we now started producing a lot more wartime efforts, war supplies. So how else does the United States wind up paying for this war? Well, when you look at it this way, the United States spent twice as much money on World War II than any other previous endeavor, including World War I. Right? So now you have to talk about how are they going to pay for it? Well, one way they try to pay for it is with taxes, right? That's how they pay for things, with taxes. So some people's taxes were actually raised around 90%, all right, to try to raise money for World War II and to try to control inflation. 90% raised to go to taxes. The government held victory loan or war bond drives, those same war bonds that were used during World War I to help pay for that war. Okay, so you had World War II loan drives. These are the ones where you could purchase this piece of paper, this bond, and you can sell it back to the government years later for an extra 5% as long as you hold on to that bond. Sources say that more than 85 million Americans spent over $185 billion on war bonds. So that's how they figured out how to pay for some of this war. The government also felt that war bonds were not enough. Rationing or fixing the consumption of goods was the answer. So how do you ration or fix the consumption of goods? Americans were issued something called a stamp book, and that's what one looks like right there. They issued them a stamp book that allows them to purchase certain goods. So it was illegal to purchase any of the following items without a stamp book. That means these were the biggest items that were going to be rationed: gas, sugar, meat, canned goods, butter, rubber, shoes, fuel oil. These type of things you could not purchase unless you had one of those stamps. It was actually illegal. They would put things out like victory speed limits. They would make you drive slower so you didn't burn as much gas. They would promote carpooling because they said if you were in a car by yourself, you were supporting Hitler. Americans would grow victory gardens in their backyard. These were personal gardens that would produce over 8 million tons of food for the soldiers at war. Women would actually draw nylons on their legs. The nylons would be used for the men at war. The Boy Scouts would lead scrap metal drives and rubber drives. These were things where they would collect all these scrap metals and all of this rubber, and they would donate it to factories, so the factories would go ahead and be able to use these goods, this metal and this rubber, and turn it into something for the war effort. Consumer goods like refrigerators and cars were just not being produced anymore. Anything that we had that we can get extra metal or extra rubber went to the war effort. So we went over a couple of things that was good about America on the war front, right? You have African Americans doing well, Mexican Americans doing better. You have white Americans going off to war. But there is something that happened on the home front that is very bad, in one word to say. The Japanese American Internment. About 125,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned or interned in these internment camps. Okay, America suspected Japanese Americans remained loyal to Japan. If you remember from the time of the gold rush, we had a large Asian population on the West Coast. Pearl Harbor is in the Pacific Ocean off the West Coast. So a lot of Americans believed that the Japanese were spies or they stayed loyal to Japan. So through like a societal pressure, Franklin Roosevelt was almost forced to sign this Executive Order 9066. And Executive Order 9066 was the relocation of all Americans of Japanese ancestry to concentration camps in the interior of the United States. Now you saw this picture right here of this camp right here. They're just barracks. They're not very nice places to live. The Japanese were forced to eat with each other in dining halls. Children were forced to attend schools at the camps. There were 10 camps in 7 western states. These states had really poor land, so they couldn't farm very well. So these 125,000, now 2/3 of these were what we call Nisi, right? These are Japanese Americans that were actually born in the United States, right? They're second generation Japanese Americans, and still they were not trusted. Now, even though a lot of these Nisi would go off to war and represent the Japanese Americans well, still a lot of Americans did not agree with it. So Korematsu versus the United States is a Supreme Court case where Fred Korematsu brings the case to court. And it is decided that the United States justifies the order 9066 as a wartime necessity. What that basically meant was in wartime, certain citizens did not receive equality under the law. Now, this is 1945 you're talking about here, the 1940s. We're still having people not having equality under the law.